worked internationally and still do. Part of my history was to be the head of the Forestry Development Group for the Ministry of Forestry during the boom years for forestry in the 1990s. I've also worked for Forest Research, but I've been out there with my own company since about 2000, and since 2004 our speciality has been solely carbon forestry. We not only specialise in growing forests for carbon sequestration, but we also are very active in the trading and the development of markets for carbon from carbon forests. And just to make that point, in the New Zealand context, on behalf of our clients, which are all over New Zealand, over last year we've averaged closer to $30 a tonne per unit sold than the top price in the carbon market in New Zealand, which is a ceiling price of $25 a tonne. And we've done that through selling to voluntary markets for corporate responsibility. So not all carbon is created equal. Okay. Well, we're at a sort of key point in the history of this territory. There's a sort of coming together of the science and the politics, and you would have seen the most recent manifestations of this with our regional council and Christchurch City Council and this Mayoral Forum, but the two former ones declaring climate emergencies. But all this talk has to translate to real action to have any benefit at all for the overall goal. And the goal is the Paris Agreement, which was struck 2 years ago, when 196 countries under the UN, out of 198, signed up for the attempt to hold greenhouse gas emissions at a level so that global temperatures wouldn't increase more than 1.5 degrees centigrade compared to their historic level before the Industrial Revolution. That's an ambitious target. It's like, gosh, can we possibly do it? So in context of that, New Zealand has reviewed its situation and made a commitment, which is to reduce our emissions. Every country under the Paris Accord has voluntarily made a commitment of what their contribution will be. New Zealand's commitment is at a level which is generally considered inadequate, quite inadequate, and it is only sufficient to get about 2/3 of the reductions. If everyone did the amount of work that we're committed to, we'd only get 2/3 of the way there. Anyway, it's a 29% reduction in our net emissions by 2030. And in that context, we have the government developing the Zero Carbon Bill, which is more ambitious, but it's further away, and which is that by 2050, New Zealand's net emissions will be zero. Part of that program, sort of related to it, but not actually that directly, is the 1 billion tree program. And the other aspect that's going on is this ongoing review, and it is certainly ongoing, about how New Zealand develops the regulations and policies that allow us to fulfil our commitment under the Paris Accord. So what have we got as a mechanism? New Zealand has only one mechanism on the table at present, and that is the emissions trading scheme and putting a price on carbon through that scheme. And under that scheme, all the New Zealand emitters of greenhouse gases, not just carbon dioxide, but all of them, excepting the agricultural sector, have emissions reduction obligations. And they have to surrender to government each year either forest carbon offsets or carbon offsets, NZUs and New Zealand units, which are equivalent to 1 tonne of CO2. They have to either surrender those or pay the government a penalty amount, which under the scheme at present is capped at $25 a tonne. So if you are a forester and you are registered in the emissions trading scheme and you are removing CO2 from the atmosphere and the growth of forests and the CO2 removals are readily, accurately measurable, then you can claim them, put them into your account, and sell them to emitters. And that's the incentive for the emitter to buy an offset, is they hope it'll be cheaper than the $25 cap. For the last 6 months, all the emissions in the New Zealand market have cost more than the cap price. So you say, why are the New Zealand emitters paying more? It's because they expect the price to go up significantly in the near future. So they're putting them away in their accounts. So how does it work? Okay, forests absorb carbon dioxide as they grow. They do that through sequestration. So it's stored in the tree trunks and the branches and the roots. And the amount of carbon that is stored depends on the species, the stocking or the density of that forest, the site quality, which is the growth capability of those sites, and also, very importantly, how long that forest is there for, because forests are very long-lived systems, and they may not maximize their carbon stocks until they're very many centuries old, and that's certainly the case with our native forests. They don't get to their peak until they're many, many hundreds of years old. Some forests are a lot faster than others. So I guess what's show you there is follow the permanent forest line, which is a forest which has not been cut down. And when this is in 1 hectare, the amount of carbon sort of that's been accumulated, if the forest keeps growing out to 50 years. And it's around, in this example, 1,400 tonnes per hectare. The other model is a harvested forest, and it grows up to about 30 years, and then it's harvested. And the carbon is released at harvest because radiata pine degrades very quickly. So it looks like a vertical fall away. Then you get down to what's stored in the ground and the roots, and it begins to recover and it grows back again. But the average level of carbon in that radiata forest is somewhere around here, compared to what happens if it's allowed to continue to grow. So if a radiata forest, which has been grown on a grow and mow basis every 30 odd years, the average level of carbon in that forest ecosystem is not what it peaks at, or the trough, it's in between, and it's about 400 or 500 tonnes per hectare. So that's all radiata forest for timber is going to ever achieve, is an average level of 400 or 500 tonnes per hectare. Whereas if it's radiata, and other examples we'll look at, and it's allowed to continue to grow, by 50 years, in this case, it's doing about 1,400 tonnes per hectare, 3 times as much sequestration per hectare. What is eligible for carbon forestry? Okay, eligibility is a bit of a hard one to get heads around. The rules were made way back when the Kyoto Agreement was formulated, which is part of the United Nations process for developing rules in this territory. And they had to decide how they let forests into this territory. And New Zealand led the negotiations on this out of self-interest, because as we've already seen, their sort of ticket to escape jail for New Zealand and to address our emissions is actually by removing CO2. So New Zealand worked very hard on this. And the criteria are actually very open and easy. Your forest has to be, first of all, on land, which in 1990, or 31st of December 1989 to be precise, was not forest land. So it has to have been non-forest or bare land at that time. No problem if you're a pastoral farmer. Any forest established after that date on bare land is potentially eligible for registration. You do have to register it. If you don't, the government will just take the carbon and include it in New Zealand's national accounts. So you have to register to participate. But to register, your forest has to be more than 1 hectare in area. That's a very small area. And it has to be at least 30 metres in width. And that would exclude normal shoulder belts. But if you planted a shoulder belt that was, say, 5 rows wide, 5 metres between rows, and allowed for the extra on either side of the outer row of trees, you can have a 30-metre wide shelter belt system which is eligible. There has to be 30% canopy cover. Now, a dense forest, like a radiata forest for timber, it will have 100% canopy cover for most of its life, and it will suppress everything underneath. If you only have 30% canopy cover and wide space trees, you'll have a lot happening underneath. It might be native forest regeneration, it might be gorse or broom underneath your trees, or it might be pasture. So forest, under this definition, can be forest grazing, woodland, wide space trees with pasture. It's not necessarily a dense timber forest. The other requirement is that the trees can meet 5 metres. Well, goodness gracious, that's not even a tree at 5 metres. It hasn't begun. Different species have very different capabilities in terms of carbon sequestration. What's urgent globally and for New Zealand in this space, and where the money will be at the front end, is doing the job in the next 2 or 3 decades. What happens in 100 or 200 years' time doesn't matter at all. It's game over. Either this is sorted out in the next 2 or 3 decades, or it isn't. So it's essential, if you're getting into this game, that you think about trees that can sequester carbon fast and efficiently. And unfortunately, if you're religious about native trees, that doesn't include any native trees. But there are a suite of introduced trees which happen to be extremely well adapted to conditions in New Zealand and grow by international standards much faster than they do in their home environments, and exceptionally fast. And they can pull CO2 out of the atmosphere at remarkable rates, which we'll see later. Anyway, so exotics can be very fast, and the short list on exotics is the ubiquitous Pinus radiata, which however much we may not like it, and wouldn't want it in our gardens, it is miraculous in how it grows. But the other set of trees, and there are many in this group, are eucalypts, and they can actually outgrow radiata in some circumstances, and they've got higher wood density, and they're nectar producing, and hey, guess what? Up to a few million years ago, eucalypts were a major feature of New Zealand's forests. They only became extinct here in the Pleistocene. So they're sort of almost natives. They're first cousins of Puritacaras and Ratas, and second cousins, I guess, of Manuka and Kānga. Okay, so exotics are fast, natives are slow. Exotics are cheap to establish, natives are costly. Establishing eucalypts or pine can be done $1,500, $2,000 a hectare. Establishing natives, if you're planting a mix of natives, the Port Hills restoration by Christchurch City Council is costing $130,000 a hectare. Isn't that unbelievable? $130,000 a hectare. I resent that, I'm a ratepayer. It's like, whoa, and it's doing nothing for carbon at all. Okay. So our company, something we do uniquely, we're quite proud of this. Whenever we do analysis of carbon growing, we not only estimate what the cash flow from it is in the future and what the internal rate of return is, the net present value, but we also work out what the dollar cost of sequestering or pulling each tonne of carbon and creating each NZU is. And if you're talking about exotics, depending on the land cost, because that affects what that is, it's as low as $10 per tonne that you pull out of the atmosphere. Land price going up, it could be up to $30, but with natives it can be up to $200 or $300 per tonne. Now when you're getting paid $25 a tonne, you don't want to be spending $300 a tonne for whatever you're going to try and sell to that market. So why has the price moved up of late? Well, there's this Paris Agreement. There's the New Zealand government's commitment to have net zero by 2050. And there's the fact that pricing carbon is the principal mechanism that New Zealand has on the table. And the idea behind pricing carbon can be described like this. You put a carbon price in the economy on everything. It's already there when you buy petrol, you're probably not aware, but there's a carbon price in what you're paying for petrol. If that price is sufficiently high, it will change your behaviour. It will change economic behaviour. So the idea behind this, and I don't entirely subscribe to it, is that having a carbon price, a sufficient carbon price, will drive the change towards energy efficiency, getting out of burning fossil fuels. That is, I guess, the end game. So, yeah, there are other things happening. Under the current New Zealand emissions trading scheme, our emitter industries are only required to pay for half of their carbon. This year, after this year, they're going to be required to pay for double all of their carbon emissions. So the demand for offsets is going to double effectively this year in the market. Yeah, and what else? Well, how big is this getting? We are talking of in the order of $1 billion industry in the emissions trading scheme on an annual basis, the value of those transactions. So it's pretty big territory. And the carbon price that we currently have, which is $25 cap in the emissions trading scheme, it's only equivalent to 7 cents per litre every time you buy a litre of petrol, which for super is about 3% of the cost. That doesn't influence your behaviour as a driver a skerrick. It's less than your supermarket discount on petrol. So we haven't even begun the price journey on a carbon price to change behaviours. So where's it going to go? Well, the Productivity Commission has analysed this territory. There have been numerous international studies, and they all end up pretty much in the same space, which is a carbon price up to that year 2050 will need to move into the territory of $200, $250 tonne, or NZU. And we're lagging a bit at present. The current price in the European market, which is the biggest carbon market, is equivalent to about $45 New Zealand a unit. There are many markets around the world now which have got prices significantly higher than New Zealand has and ours. And the government's about, as I said, it's taking the cap off next year. The price will be allowed to increase. It's also said it's going to put a floor price in there, so that collapse in prices that you saw on the previous slide will not happen again. There are two schemes in New Zealand. There's the Permanent Forest Sink Initiative scheme, and that's the oldest scheme. When we started in the territory and we were lobbying government, that was the only scheme. It's the only scheme which has international credibility. And we've managed to develop a voluntary carbon unit in the context of that scheme, and we've sold close to 1 million units to buyers in North America from permanent forests in New Zealand to buyers in Europe and North America. Outside and in addition to the compliance scheme, which is New Zealand's emissions trading scheme. So there are voluntary markets and there are these compliance markets where the government requires under regulation that you either pay for your penalty or you surrender an offset instead of paying that penalty. Right, the permanent forest scheme, the main point of distinction is you're not allowed to cut it down or exit the scheme for 50 years. That's hardly permanence. And if the carbon price is good, you wouldn't get out at 50 years, you'd stay on because you'd still be making good money because forests don't stop growing at 50 years. We sell permanent forest carbon units in the voluntary market context for corporate responsibility purposes to Z Energy, Air New Zealand for their fly neutral program, to Environmark for their international carbon neutral programs. And in all those contexts, we get a significant premium. So not all carbon is created equal, but the big volume market is the spot market, and that's the New Zealand ETS. The government's brought in the Billion Tree program. In some respects, I applaud it. It's great to have government showing support. Sadly, I don't know who got mixed into the government conversation on this. They've said 2/3 of the money is for growing native trees, which is absolutely ridiculous if you're thinking about sequestration of carbon, for reasons I've spoken about before. Our native trees, love them as we do, are very slow growing and very expensive and will not do the job in the near term. And we have a lot of native tree projects, and we discount our charges to our clients who have native tree projects almost as a charity, but a lot of them are charitable trusts like Hawaii, New Zealand Native Forest Restoration Trust. So the only income they get really is from the sale of carbon. Okay, so what's available under the Billion Tree program? It should be targeted, I hope, only at supporting afforestation of marginal land. It would be wrong if it was encouraging afforestation of land which is valuable for food production, for cropping and intensive agriculture. We're not into that, that's wrong if that was the outcome. And if it's pushing up land prices unduly. But I don't think it is. The main driver that carbon will bring to land prices is the actual price of carbon. We'll talk about that again. So under the scheme, if you are accepted, you apply. If you apply for land which is marginal land and which has got erosion problems, you're much more likely to be accepted readily. And if you're accepted readily, you could be up for, if you were planting natives, you could be getting $4,000 a hectare assistance. But hey, if it's costing you $40,000 a hectare, that's not much assistance. Whereas with the exotics, you can be paid up to, or paid $1,500 a hectare. And if you've got a very easy land situation, that might cover all your costs, or a significant amount of your costs. So it really affects the economics of growing fast-growing exotic species. It really lifts the economics hugely. And I think it's fantastic, but unfortunately only a small amount of money is currently earmarked for supporting exotic projects. And that $80 million might sound a lot, but it's only 5%, it'll only support 5% of the planting that's required with fast-growing trees to offset half of New Zealand's emissions, which to my mind is the logical goal, that we should be using trees to offset about half of our total emissions. Okay, so I mentioned before calculating the cost of removing 1 tonne of CO2 or creating 1 New Zealand unit. Without the Billion Tree funding on the far left, purple, slight advantage for radiata pine. With the funding, there's no advantage compared to those particular models, eucalyptus or radiata pine. And that is because if you get the funding for radiata pine, the government actually takes the first 6 years of carbon. Whereas if you grow any other species than radiata pine, you get all the carbon right from the beginning. So that's why the Billion Tree works better, slightly better for other species, in that case, eucalyptus. Okay, in the past, any astute person in this space would have got really anxious about the liability issues for carbon. If you grew a radiata forest on that grow and mow pattern, you might sell all your carbon on the grow period, and then when you cut it down and all that carbon's released, you've got to pay it back under the current scheme. And if you're paying it back at say $100 a tonne and you've sold it at $20 a tonne, you're probably not going to cut your forest down, and you're going to be looking, whoa, I've got a massive liability, I can't cut my forest down. Okay, but what's happened is the government's realised this was a massive inhibition for astute investors. So they've introduced what's called the averaging approach. And the new approach under averaging creates a situation where you can enjoy, for new forests, selling the carbon as the first rotation gets up to that long-term average level, the upper green dotted line on that graph. You don't get any more carbon after that. And it works out you get the carbon up to about age 18, say, on a 30-year rotation. When you cut the forest down, you have no liability under this new scheme at all. So it's great. the internal rates of return go from about 5% up to 8%, just on the basis, at $25 a tonne, just on the basis of having the use of the carbon in that first 18 years to sell. But you will never have it again, but you've never got a liability. With the permanent forests, and these are the ones that might even accumulate not 500 tonnes per hectare average, but 1,500 tonnes, or 2,000, or 2,500 tonnes. If you had a situation where those forests, for some reason, were blown out by a volcanic eruption, completely destroyed or whatever, incredibly intense fire, and you suddenly had a payback obligation, wow, that would freak you out. If you had 2,000 tonnes that you were paying back at $100 a tonne. The government has said we will cover those obligations as well, providing the loss of carbon is an act of God, it's not a criminal activity, it hasn't been deliberately burned or cleared. But the only proviso is you will not get any more carbon issued to you after that carbon loss event until the forest has grown back to that previous level. And when it goes beyond that, you'll start getting carbon again. So it takes away that financial risk and uncertainty. Carbon price risk is the other territory. These markets are entirely created by regulation. First of all, under the United Nations, and we've signed up to those processes and we can't escape them. But secondly, within that context, we have our own regulatory environment. So we've elected to create the market in a particular way. And New Zealand is a leader globally in developing a market which covers a broad sector of the economy, not agriculture yet, but includes forestry. There's no other emissions trading scheme in the world, except California, which embraces forestry. There are about 30 schemes working around the world at present. Okay, so what's happening with price? It's been extremely volatile. And this big dip here was when the bogus Russian and Ukrainian units were allowed into New Zealand. I'm sure you'll remember when the prices collapsed from $20, ended up $1.50 for a New Zealand unit. And in fact, you could buy the Russian units for 10 cents each. They had no substance. They were a complete fraud, but it was a great money laundering opportunity in the order of $1 billion within the New Zealand economy. It's one of the most scandalous government official aided money laundering episodes, I think. But we weren't too exceptional. There's been extraordinary corruption in carbon markets in Europe and China. This is territory, because you can't see CO2, you've got to be really careful about the measurement and the verification. And there are a lot of disciplines behind this territory to make it work. And to be honest, if it's not honest, it's not useful and it's not going to do the job. New Zealand can never cheat again. We really did our reputation globally in this territory when we allowed those Russian units in. There was no other jurisdiction in the world which would allow those units in. It was a pure cheat. A lot of us made, I didn't, a lot of people made a hell of a lot of money, and almost every major New Zealand company avoided a real cost on carbon. And a lot of them had already passed on the expected costs to us consumers, and they never recompensed us when they got off the hook for free. But anyway, that's part of history. It won't happen again. New Zealand has committed internationally that it will never allow unaudited units without environmental integrity back into New Zealand. So we will, I'm sure, and the government said it wants to be able to use international units. It's one way of keeping supply going and keeping prices in our market subdued at a level so the government can let them in at a level which keeps prices within a range which is palatable, you might say, in New Zealand.
10 minutes, Mark.
Sorry?
10 minutes.
Thank you, Sarah. Okay, I'll try to get there in 10 minutes. Okay, very quickly, just an example of the effects on the internal rate of return from a timber forest without the billion tree grant. Timber only in this model, grown and mown, 5.7% rate of return, average radiata. with the carbon, lifts it up to basically a 10% rate of return. And that's only for carbon in those front end years, in that first 18 years. Thereafter, you're depending on timber entirely. If we added the billion tree grant in the front end of that, then the internal rate of return for timber and carbon would lift to about 14% internal rate of return. Now the land cost assumption here, $4,000 a hectare. I have to be really clear about this. If we said, look, this is a gorse area, it's got no value for farming, it's just an ongoing cost, and we put a zero land value on it, those internal rates of return, and this works for a pure carbon forest without the timber as well, they jump up over 20%, at $25 a tonne before the price of carbon goes up. If we put $4,000 a hectare, and let's say, hey, that's extensive grazing country, relatively, it's not very good, might be carrying 5 stock units a hectare. You are looking at a 9%, 10% rate of return, either for a permanent forest or for a timber and carbon forest. They're both about the same. If your land value is good dairying land, so it's $50,000 a hectare, forget it. The price of land cannot be high for a good return on carbon forestry under any circumstances. It makes zero economic investment sense to go and buy expensive land to plant trees for carbon. Good land shouldn't be under threat. You'd have to be totally ignorant as an investor to spend more than $4,000 a hectare when trees will grow just as well on land which cost you $4,000 a hectare. Might even grow better than they would on land that might cost $50,000 a hectare. So we've heard about the Wairoa concerns, and I share those concerns. I hate seeing masses of trees displacing good farming. I like to see trees integrated properly within farms. But the long-term message is when people get their heads around it, we will not be buying expensive farmland to grow carbon forests. Okay, we'll jump that one and we'll go straight on to land availability. I mentioned that to sequester half of New Zealand's total emissions, which is 40 million tonnes a year, with fast-growing species like radiata and eucalypts, only requires permanent, not temporary harvested, but permanent forests of 1 million hectares. And that can be accommodated on our highly erodible marginal land within farms without displacing any good farmland at all. So that should be where our policies and encouragements from government are taking us on this journey. We have to do this for New Zealand to meet its obligations, but we can do it very cost effectively on marginal farmland. We do not need to go to good land. Okay, so in that territory, the landowners are in the box seat. What a lucky bunch of people you are if you've got marginal farmland, which isn't contributing much income to your farm. You've got a slightly different situation if you're a dairy farmer, very significantly different, but you should be looking then, if you are interested in banking carbon offsets, you should be looking to be doing it with a neighbouring farm on their marginal land under a forestry rate, or buying some marginal land yourself to do it. So just some ideas about planning for carbon forestry. This is at Waipori, 400 metres, Southland. The only farm in this landscape who'd used trees. Thank God it was a beautiful place, and the rest of the landscape was cold and barren. Anyway, he'd located his trees beautifully, but the point is, you identify the land which is more problematic within the weft and weave of your farm. And those are prospective areas for carbon forestry. And for that land, it's good to think about what is the land expectation value? What is the value of that land in terms of your farming business? What is it actually contributing in income? And arrive at a realistic appraisal of its value for you. It might be $2,000 a hectare. whereas the best parts of your farm might be $50,000 a hectare. There's a huge disparity across our varied landscapes, not on the flat plains, but across our hill country especially, between the very good land and the land which is seriously marginal or useless.
5 minutes.
Okay, then we need to identify the species options which are going to be best in terms of earnings and so on. And we can work out the internal rates of return at different carbon prices, what the cash flow would be from carbon and or timber. You can look then at the financial options for financing it. And that supposes that you get some pretty good advice from your accountants, your farm advisors, about what land, and from your forestry advisors. On the left is an image of trees, forest grazing on top dairy land in the Ureti in Southland. They were planted at 10 metre spacings. They will never suppress the grass. They provide shelter and really important for the well-being of the livestock. Probably for the well-being of the farmer as well in that part of the world sometimes. There's a serious amount of carbon in those trees too. And they are 20-year-old eucalyptus regnans. The right-hand image is back to that Waipuri farm up above Miller's Flat. It's just been thinned out, eucalyptus nitens, and he's about to fertilise and grass that area is thinned for forest grazing. Again, really important for livestock shelter and well-being in that environment. Radiata pine isn't the only option, and the photo on the left I like because here we have radiata pura on the far left, then in amongst it we've got some eucalypts being feathered in, and then on the right hand side we've got pure eucalypts. And you can see in the canopies that the eucalypts are actually taller than the radiata pine on that pretty average 1,000 mm hill country site in Canterbury. And eucalypts have twice the wood density per cubic metre of volume that radiata pine has. Sorry, 1.5 times, 50% more wood density. So there's a lot more carbon. You can't just judge it by looking at the volume of trees. On the right, we have Douglas fir forest, planted, it's 85 years old. It's been production thinned. It's got an amazing understory of native plants. I hope you can see that. The cheapest way to establish native plants is to plant a nurse crop of exotic trees. Eucalypts are a lot better than Douglas fir. Thin them out, the birds will bring in the seed, and underneath is an ideal environment for them to flourish in. You see this time and again. That forest, incidentally, Douglas fir is one of the highest valued commercial timbers in the world. And that 85-year-old forest has the highest volume of any Douglas fir forest in the world. And it's only 85 years old. If you go to the Pacific Northwest, Vancouver Island, and look at old Douglas fir forests there at Stanley Park in Vancouver, the oldest trees are 800 years old. But the total standing volume per hectare is less than what it is in that 85-year-old state. We have extraordinarily good conditions in microsites in New Zealand for growing trees. And not all forests are about pure money. This is Hamner Forest. I love this image. This was planted around 1905 when there was a lot of experimentation with different species. And if you'd been there, you would have totally enjoyed the experience of being in an absolutely beautiful environment. So we can have trees for beautifying our environments, making them more interesting. And the massive tree on the left is radiata pine. It just shows that radiata pine can be more than 100 years old and very happily strong and growing, which is true. But you know, that is a wonderful environment. It's got a lot of carbon. I estimate about 1,500 tonnes per hectare. And if you analyse that, you know, you're talking about many hundreds of dollars per hectare per annum. So it's not to be sniffed at. In conclusion, we have a lot happening. There's an opportunity that's been driven by the Paris Accord, New Zealand's zero carbon commitment, and now the Billion Tree Program, giving it an extra spurt. Carbon price is high, it's expected to go a lot higher. New Zealand's net zero target requires, at least as a minimum, 1 million hectares of additional super fast growing trees. If we do it inefficiently, if if we did it with natives, we'd need 15 million hectares, which would entirely annihilate all productive land in New Zealand, whereas a million hectares can be easily accommodated. Okay, so the risks about it are being addressed strongly by the government. It's really taking on the risks on our behalf. And there are lots of ways of financing this. You can get advice and assistance. You landowners are in the box seat on this opportunity. And yep, of course, we don't know what the future holds in price, but it's looking more certain now than it's ever looked before. Thank you.